She woke early that Wednesday, not because of an alarm or obligation, but because the restlessness that had tugged at her all week finally loosened its grip. The sun had barely begun to lighten the sky, yet she was already moving with purpose. Her younger son was in school, and for the first time in days, she didn't have to clock in, listen, serve, or smile if she didn't feel like it. The day belonged to her, and she knew exactly where she needed to be. She filled a small thermos with hot tea and packed her camera, an extra lens, and a weathered notebook she hadn't opened in some time. There was no breakfast, only a quiet urgency that pushed her out the door. She drove through the soft blue of early morning, the streets half asleep and empty, the world not yet fully awake. Even her thoughts were quieter. There was no playlist today, only the rhythmic hum of the tires and the soft whisper of wind pressing through the cracked window. The preserve greeted her in half-light. A soft mist hung low over the trees and grass, clinging to branches and collecting on the edges of wildflower petals like dew. The gravel beneath her tires was muted by the moisture in the air, and when she stepped out of the car, the sound of her boots pressing into the wet ground was barely audible. She wrapped her cardigan around her tighter and breathed in the layered scent of earth, bark, and the early hints of algae rising from the water. Instead of taking the familiar path past the marsh and meadow, she turned directly toward the lake. It had called to her in a way that felt instinctive, not loud or demanding but magnetic. There was something she needed to face there, something waiting just below the surface like the water itself. The trail to the lake curved gently through a wooded section where the fog was thickest. It coiled between tree trunks and hovered just above the ground like a memory made visible. Sunlight had not yet reached this part of the preserve, and the world felt suspended, soft, gray, and absolutely still. The only sound came from the rustling of a few small birds high in the canopy, breaking the quiet only briefly before vanishing again. As she neared the water's edge, she slowed. Lake emerged gradually from the fog. A broad mirror stretched across the forest floor. It was perfectly still, untouched by wind or movement. The reflections it held were so precise that for a moment, she felt unsteady, as if sky and earth had merged and she had stepped into something otherworldly. Trees rose from both above and below, duplicated in such detail that it became difficult to tell where the shoreline ended and the mirrored world began. She raised her camera and began to work slowly. The shutter clicked gently in the morning quiet, capturing layered reflections, pine branches overlapping with clouds, lily pads floating above their own mirrored shadows, the faint shimmer of the rising sun filtered through fog. Each frame held more than beauty. It held silence, precision, presence. These weren't just photographs. They were small acts of reverence. She moved carefully along the water's edge, watching her breath rise in front of her, curling like the mist that danced above the lake. Then she paused. Across the inlet, barely visible through the fog, stood a blue heron. Tall, statuesque, and impossibly still, it balanced on a submerged log, its head tilted slightly downward, eyes trained on the water below. Her breath caught. She adjusted the lens and focused slowly. The heron didn't flinch. It remained motionless, a silhouette etched against the lake's surface, as if painted into the scene rather than born from it. She clicked the shutter once, then again. The sound didn't disturb the bird. It was too far, too absorbed in its own moment. Still, she lowered the camera and simply watched. Something about the bird, its poise, its discipline, its solitary elegance, stirred something deeper in her. A memory emerged without invitation. She hadn't thought about that morning in years. Her mother standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the garden as steam rose from her mug, hands wrapped tightly around the ceramic like it was the only thing anchoring her to the room. The image had lived quietly in her for a long time, unspoken and unresolved. But now by the lake, with the heron standing in the same quiet alertness, it resurfaced fully, like something long submerged. She remembered how her mother's silence that day had filled the entire kitchen. How she hadn't asked for help but had needed it. How even then, as a teenager still learning her own shape, the healing woman had known something was breaking in her mother, something fragile like glass held too long in trembling hands. And just as quickly as the memory arrived, so did a wave of emotion. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just full. She didn't cry, but her eyes brimmed slightly, and she didn't blink them away. She let them rest there, soft and present. The heron remained still, only its neck moving slightly as it studied the water. Then, with one elegant motion, it spread its wings and lifted into the air. The flight was silent, effortless. The bird cut across the fog like a brushstroke, trailing its shadow below on the lake's mirror. The healing woman watched until it vanished beyond the trees. She sat then, just sat, not photographing anymore. The fog began to lift, thinned by the warming light. The lake shimmered brighter now, less mysterious, more tangible, but still beautiful, still sacred. She pulled out her notebook and wrote a single line. Stillness doesn't mean nothing is happening. Then she closed the cover, stood slowly, and walked the path back through the trees. The mist clung a little less, and the sun warmed the top of her shoulders. Her breath came easier now, fuller. What she carried with her wasn't gone, but it had shifted, softened, made room for something more.